Um, so you're okay, Joseph?
Yes.
Start? Yep, okay. So welcome all to this month's installment of the CAR seminar series. Today we have Dr. Joseph Guillaume, who is a research fellow at the Fenner School of Environmental and Society at the Australian National University, invited as a guest from Ivan Hannigan as part of CAR. So Joseph is a DECRA research fellow in the Fenner School of Environment and Society at ANU. He is an integrated modeler with a particular interest in uncertainty and decision support. Application areas are focused primarily on water resources. His ongoing work involves providing a synthesis of the many ways we communicate about uncertainty and their implications for modeling and decision support. So Joseph, if you'd like to continue on and tell us about what we're going to talk about today. And sorry, just to note that for those listening, if you have questions, so please type them into the chat box and we'll tend to those at the end of this hour. Okay, thanks.
Thanks for the introduction and thank you everybody for joining. So I'll be talking about uncertainty framing, and by that we mean how do we describe the role of uncertainty when we're communicating the results of an analysis. So I'm from a water modeling background, but Ivan Hannigan has helped to prepare a case study using air pollution. So I'd like to jump straight in and look at some examples where there is no uncertainty. So here we have a quote: "Particulate air pollution shortens lives globally even more than cigarettes. There is no greater current risk to human health." And there is so little uncertainty in this statement that even the website URL says it's pollution facts. I've picked a second example here, and this one's from an abstract of a journal article. And what I've done here is remove all of the text that indicates uncertainty in any way at all. So we have a statement now that reads very straightforward: of an arbitrary Chinese policy that greatly increases total suspended particulate air pollution is causing the 500 million residents of northern China to lose 2.76 billion life years of life expectancy. The analysis, which provided free winter heating, denied heat to in the north, denied heat to the south. Using a regression discontinuity design, we find that ambient concentrations are so much in the south, so much in the north. Life expectancies are 5.5 years lower in the north. More generally, long-term exposure to an additional 100 micrograms is associated with a reduction in life expectancy at birth of 3 years. And so you probably had a reaction to those claims, some perhaps in support of the overall conclusion that air pollution is bad, perhaps skeptical of the specific results. Maybe you're already familiar with this text. It is a high profile and controversial case. In this case, I won't be discussing the merits of the statistical techniques or forming judgment about the p-values. Instead, what I want to do is try to suspend judgment for the time being. We just want to focus on understanding how uncertainty was addressed and why. We can think of it as taking a break and just looking at other people taking the toboggan down the hill of scientific debate. And at the end, I will come back to addressing the question of whether uncertainty was actually adequately addressed. So I'll first give a little bit of background on uncertainty framing, and then launch into this discussion of a journal article, the responses to it, and some media coverage as well, and then come back to that idea of how should uncertainty actually have been addressed or communicated. So I want to start really in the basics here, just to make sure that we're on the same page. When I talk about uncertainty, I simply mean lack of certainty. So we have on the top left here a case where we have a deterministic outcome into the future. If we're then talking about uncertainty, it simply means we're not in that situation. We might have a distribution or bounds on our prediction, or we might have multiple scenarios. We might also have more complicated situations where we have distributions or bounds around separate scenarios. And we can kind of generalize this perspective. Well, this simple definition of uncertainty is actually enough to build some analysis around, using this idea of a path perspective on uncertainty. So here we have a hiker looking back at where they've come from. We realize here that uncertainty comes from standing at the fork in a road and knowing that depending on which analysis path we take, we might actually end up with a different conclusion. And so this idea is general enough. It also applies to paths forward for management. And so we can use this idea of being at a fork where we have an uncertain choice in front of us to think about, well, how should we be investing in reducing or controlling the uncertainty, or investing in better describing the uncertainty, or proceeding with what we already have, maybe is how we should actually be dealing with uncertainty in a particular case. So we can take this path metaphor and try to build a little more around it. We can use it as a way of analyzing a particular situation. We can describe a process in terms of the steps that were involved, identifying what the decision forks were, where we were facing that choice of different alternatives to pick between. And so uncertainty here becomes a question of in what ways were the pathways we were considering at that point actually closed down? Were we facing the whole uncertainty more broadly, or had we actually closed it down to only a single option going forward was actually considered? So that kind of follows through a project step by step. We can also do that through an argument. If we start from a conclusion and look at where did this conclusion come from? In this case, it came from step 2, which in turn came from step 1. And so where does uncertainty come into this? Well, at some point we have some uncertain premises within our argument. And these are kind of potential vulnerabilities of our conclusion that we need to address. So in order to make our argument and our conclusion acceptable, what we want to do is to neutralize the uncertainty in those premises. And this is where that uncertainty framing comes in. Because we've described the role of uncertainty in an appropriate way, the uncertain premises is then accepted by the person that we're talking to. So what we've seen there is already that this notion of communication is a very powerful way of approaching, or communication of uncertainty framing, powerful way of approaching the topic of uncertainty. But it's most visible when we're talking about it, even if it's just that we're talking to ourselves about this uncertainty. So we can use communication of uncertainty as a way in to understand how to manage uncertainty more generally. If we have this situation with uncertainty everywhere, we're going to do something, communicate it to an audience who are going to make a decision based on the information we want. We have this process where we have research under uncertainty, but then we need to decide what we can actually conclude given the evidence that we have. We're going to communicate that conclusion. There might be some contestation and negotiation, for example, in a peer review process, and then there's going to be action taken based on that conclusion. So uncertainty framing fits in that point of communicating your conclusion, which we're asking ourselves, what do we need to know about uncertainty in the conclusion? And the aim there is that when the audience listens to what we said, they know how does uncertainty affect how I can use this information, and they're going to change their decision based on what we gave them. This also then propagates back the other way. If we know what we're going to communicate, then we can say, well, what useful statement can I make given the uncertainty, taking that into account in the process. And then all the way back to how should I actually handle the uncertainty, given I'm going to be making a particular statement, communicated in a particular way that the decision maker is then going to make use of. So that kind of gives us a framework for thinking about how we're going to make decisions about uncertainty and communicate it. How can we go about thinking about how this is used in practice? Well, a simple starting point is to simply reflect on what we're doing at the moment. So if we list our main conclusions, we can think of, well, what does the reader need to know or expect to hear about the role of uncertainty in coming to each conclusion. What does each sentence already say about uncertainty? What have you left out? And the reason I gave those examples without uncertainty to begin with is because a useful trick there is to think about what would your conclusion actually say if there wasn't any uncertainty? How would you reword it? If we take some simple examples here from the water domain, something without uncertainty, we can say there is enough water. We could also say, according to best available science, there is enough water. So we've already made our claim conditional on the knowledge we have now. We could also use probabilities, say we are 95% sure, or confidence intervals or bounds of water availability is between this range. And so here we're already seeing we've come up with 4 different ways in which uncertainty might have been framed. So what other ones might there be? So we did a study of abstracts in the journal Water Resources Research in 2015. And basically we went through and classified each of the claims in the abstracts. We looked at what qualifiers were used in the sentences, what was the structure of the argument that then affected how the conclusions were interpreted. And what we ended up with was 18 different frames that we categorized into 5 different approaches. So I'll just briefly go through the 5 approaches, and then the details of each of these frames we'll actually come back to as part of the case study later. So one way of addressing uncertainty is to look at to what extent is the conclusion ready to be used? How mature or useful is it? We can also address uncertainty by limiting the scope of its applicability. What limitations are there on how the conclusion can be used? Maybe a more traditional form in science is to look at the level of belief of how certain is the author that the conclusion is true. We can also look at the depth of analysis of how thoroughly has the issue been examined. And this is kind of where uncertainty quantification or triangulation and robustness come in, of saying how much did we explore what other answers might actually be possible. The 5th one relates more to how a conclusion is communicated in terms of rhetoric. It's how do we end up relating this statement to what the reader already knows in order to increase the chance that the reader will accept what we're saying. So I'll go through each of these in a bit more detail in a minute. But before we do that, I wanted to look at, well, how do we decide how to frame uncertainty? So these are just a few ideas on this topic. And the first thing is, obviously, this is not something that we're explicitly taught at any point, really. We learn it from experience, we look at what others do, and as part of that contestation and negotiation process, that's part of the learning process for people writing papers for the first time, of looking at what reviewers are willing to accept and reject. At the same time, we have this pressure to aim for stronger arguments that have greater impact. And at the same time, we want to provide it as soon as possible. So there is this idea of cutting corners so we can make stronger claims than what our evidence already, in principle, would allow, but with appropriate uncertainty framing of recognizing that there's still some doubt around this. And the other issue then is, what do we mean by a strong argument actually depends on what the impact is that we want that conclusion to have. So there, the idea is to think about what stage of the audience's decision-making process we're actually connecting to. So I'll just briefly go through these ideas a little bit more now. So in terms of contestation and negotiation, so I'm using modeling as an example, we have this idea that when challenged, we could either strengthen our argumentative position. So for example, we could use new evidence that's actually acceptable to the challenger. We could defend our position and say, well, actually what we've done is already fit for purpose. It's already enough evidence to make the conclusion that we've got. Or we could wind back the argumentative position and say, well, actually, it's correct. The conclusion we made can't be supported, and we're going to change our conclusion to be a little weaker as a result. And what each of these looks like, it varies depending on what the uncertainty framing category is that we're dealing with. And so if we're talking about maturity, Then to strengthen the position might involve improving the model or arguing it's already fit for purpose. If we're talking about scope, it might be about expanding our tests of validity of a model, or arguing that the challenge is irrelevant to the conclusion, that because of the scope we've chosen, the criticisms aren't applicable. In terms of level of belief, we want to increase the confidence, or in terms of depth of analysis, we want to explore more and alternative lines of argument. And so we've got these different choices that we can make in terms of how we increase the strength of our argument. In terms of connecting to the audience, this is how one of the key factors in which we can choose which of these approaches we're going to use. So if we take an idealized conceptualization of how audience makes decisions, they want to focus attention, search for arguments and evidence, evaluate the support for those arguments, achieve a recommendation for action that then is actually an action taken in the environment. So what happens if we convey the maturity of a result? It means we're drawing attention to a problem or the fact that future work is needed, or we're just saying, actually, the evidence is here, we need to go on to the next stage. So what we're doing here is feeding into focusing attention. If we emphasize the scope, what we're doing is providing insight into fundamental arguments that can be used as part of this decision-making process. We're contributing to this search for arguments. If we're emphasizing the level of uncertainty in the search, how thorough were we in getting the information, then what we're doing is providing the evidence needed for the decision maker to evaluate support. If we're giving the confidence in the result directly, we're saying how seriously should this information be taken. We're already giving a recommendation for action about whether to accept this recommendation. And finally, that fifth one of using rhetorical devices is about ensuring that you're heard. And so our results from analyzing the abstracts of water resources research show that all of these frames are actually used. The most common ones are indeed expressed as fact. So nearly every abstract has at least one claim that doesn't have any uncertainty present there. And this actually makes sense because in an abstract, we don't have much space, and the reader's clever enough that they're going to know that some of these claims do have uncertainty, but it's just not relevant to the argument at this point. The second most frequent is validate and defend, of saying, I've done the work necessary, you must believe my conclusion. And obviously this is part of that need to have strong arguments as part of a scientific publishing process. But what we have then is there's a whole lot of other frames that are sitting at around 25% of abstracts or 20% of abstracts that they are very common. Sorry. Okay, so what we've got here is we've looked at, sorry, I just interrupted there for a second. Okay, so these results applied in water resources research abstracts in particular. So what we're interested in is looking at our case study now. So the case study is looking at the effect of life expectancy in China of air pollution due to a particular coal heating policy. So there was a situation from 1950 to 1980 that free coal for winter heating was provided in the north, but not in the south. And there's a study in 2013 in particular that made the strong claim that more than 2.5 billion life years were lost. And as is customary with proceedings of PNAS, an invited commentary from Pope and Dockery was then written and published at the same time as this article. However, the method here was critiqued by Andrew Guillaume in 2014 for the use of polynomial regression, which was then followed by the same authors publishing a new analysis with a slightly different method. And Andrew Guillaume posted again later some criticisms in both 2018 and 2019, partly associated with a new use of the same results, in which the authors used their estimates of life years lost to have an air quality life index with a nice interactive map intended for a large audience, and in particular it was picked up by the Washington Post. So what we're going to do is just step through each of these three parts, the journal article, the response, and the Washington Post example, and see how uncertainty was framed. So this was the example I gave at the start without any uncertainty framing at all. And we can add in within this, firstly, some of the more subtle ones where we've actually, what I've had to do is change the wording of the conclusions in order to remove the way our uncertainty was addressed. So instead of saying lose 2.76 billion life years, what they actually said was to lose more than 2.5 billion life years. And so they're quantifying uncertainty in the process. Instead of saying that they've just used an analysis approach, they've said that they're using a quasi-experimental empirical approach. And the implication there is that they're following an accepted way of drawing conclusions. And therefore, if they satisfy the requirements of that accepted method, then you should also accept their conclusions. The third one's a little more subtle. What they've done is, instead of giving absolute numbers of air pollution, they've made it relative. They've talked about the difference between air pollution in the south and the north. And in the process, they've avoided any uncertainty or debate about what is the minimum air pollution that might be actually harmful. It's just assuming that more is worse, and that's the end of the story. So they're shaping the way that we're approaching the topic. In the next phase, so what we've got here is they actually start the abstract by saying this paper's findings suggest. And so there's a notion here that it's a make it hypothetical, make it conditional, that it's not necessarily them that are making this suggestion. It's if you believe the method of the paper, then you would believe the conclusion. But it's also only just a suggestion that it's possible that the results are completely different to what's actually there. But at the same time, later in the article, they talk about, well, what they estimate is about 184 micrograms per meter cubed, and then give a confidence interval. So here there's this funny aspect that the about is already quantifying the uncertainty there, and I suppose not in explicit terms, but saying that, you know, it's on that order, that we expect some spread around this value. And then in addition to that vague qualitative description, they've also used the formal statistical representation. It's an uncertainty quantification in terms of a confidence interval associated with a degree of belief, the 95%. And the implication in this case is also implicitly demonstrating the robustness of the results, that somehow this confidence interval doesn't cross zero and therefore is statistically significant. So if we think about what are the frames that were used in this part, we have that first part of the way they've approached the topic as a whole is relying on the authority of a particular statistical approach and focusing on the difference on the effect size. Then they have this quite weak framing of saying that this is just a hypothetical conditional result, that it's just a possibility. And this clashes a little bit within that formal approach of using statistical methods to estimate the uncertainty, demonstrate the robustness and the degree of belief. So maybe my reading of the situation here isn't exactly what the authors meant. Maybe it was actually just a figure of speech that they say these findings suggest. And maybe they didn't actually even think about uncertainty framing with the confidence intervals. They were actually just following accepted practice. But the important thing here is that this is what they communicated to their audience, and this is what the audience actually then picks up on. So let's see, how did Pope and Dockery respond to it? So their commentary was built around the idea of looking at, are the results plausible? Are they coherent with other epidemiological studies? And so here we're talking about notions of robustness. There's also an idea of a new view on an existing result. So this is a rhetorical trick of saying the conclusion is actually something more or less that was expected. And so what's changed here is just that they've provided a new way of getting the same conclusion. And the reason this is an important rhetorical trick is because you're more likely to accept the method of getting the result if you actually accept the result in the first place. This is their one statement in the commentary. They say that this study provides a dramatic and interesting example, and it's an adept use of a well-developed method. And so here, I don't know if it was intended, but there's nearly a notion that the ends justifies the means, that because we want air pollution to be recognized as an important problem, the fact that this is an interesting example already makes it valid, even if the statistical method is questionable. But at the same time, this is an easy thing for them to say, because they do believe that the result, the method is actually valid. As part of their analysis, when they're talking about biological plausibility, they again introduce some uncertainty there of indicating that this is actually just a possibility as well. So in the process, they've actually recognized there is a weakness in the overall argument. That it's also a possibility that it may not be sufficient and that there's other confounding factors involved. In their conclusion, they talk about, with regard to the health effects of air pollution, there remains much to be learned. So there's this notion here that they're saying that even though this is a great study and it looked like it was valid, it's still just a step towards a goal. And it's only making a contribution to an existing base. It's part of this bigger picture, and actually more work is needed. So they're saying that this is just building the foundations, and they're suggesting, you know, there's a research agenda here that still needs to be pursued. So this was kind of the perspective from an epidemiological side. Andrew Guillaume provides a statistician's view. So this is a paper in his paper in 2014. This is a rather harsh criticism that it's, even though it's statistically significant, it's substantively dubious and sensitive to model choice. In fact, here we're talking about 3 different forms of robustness. And he's saying that, well, the statistical robustness that's demonstrated by the fact that changing that sample uncertainty doesn't change your result, it's actually irrelevant because it's not robust to thinking about what is the actual mechanisms involved. And it's not robust to if the actual statistical model had actually been selected as well. In their recommendations, they point out that high degree polynomials cannot accurately convey uncertainty. They say that researchers should consider the problems involved, but my reading there is they're kind of just saying that, no, we shouldn't actually be using the uncertainty estimates in this context. So he's kind of rejecting that framing as well. But then stepping back from there, and I suppose this is a rather common argument in the debate about p-values and significance, is saying that often issues are inconclusive and that statistical significance shouldn't necessarily be a condition for publication. And so there's this idea here that it would have been okay for this paper to just frame itself as a step towards a goal. It just shouldn't have made that jump to saying that the result is actually robust. In 2019, he followed up with a blog post. The short story is that he's skeptical about the numbers. And so this is kind of a reflective, trying to work out what is the actual approach should have been used. So what if these particular numbers had been used? Well, he's saying, well, the numbers are important. The numbers are important because they're the ones that are being reported that are drawing the attention. There's a specific claim about the magnitude of effects. And so he's saying, well, this new view on existing result doesn't actually stand. Just because we like the result doesn't mean that those numbers are actually still valid. We shouldn't be framing this conclusion in those terms. He says, I just don't know what to think. Maybe the press should be careful about reporting these numbers uncritically. And in other words, what he's saying there is maybe the press should actually be including some kind of uncertainty framing rather than simply reporting them as fact. Maybe it doesn't matter because it's a crisis. So it's better to have falsely precise numbers than none at all. He's worried about the overestimates. And so there's a notion here again, he's repeating that this uncertainty quantification is just not reliable. It's not what actually should have been used. But if he's willing to accept falsely precise numbers, then maybe there's a notion there that he's suggesting that the uncertainty framing that could have been used is to say that it's just a possibility. This was just one estimate. And if we need an estimate, then having one is better than not having one. And so Ivan has shared this particular cartoon with me that kind of captures that perspective. So in what context might it make sense to just make up some numbers? With some justification, but not a very particular strong one. And that's where this Washington Post article and the media angle comes in. Because what the authors did next, I'm way ahead of myself. Okay, so just to recap what we did in this part, Pope and Dockery first emphasized this maturity side of the uncertainty frames that wasn't emphasized in the original paper. They still accept this robustness and this validity. And then what Guillaume has come in and done is say, well, actually the robustness and uncertainty of quantification and the new view on existing results were not actually legitimate frames in this case. But it would have been possible to say it was just a possibility. So what the authors did is to create an atlas of an air quality life index. And so we can see here, there's no trace of uncertainty on the screen. It's intended for impact, all the way to the fact that there are news articles reporting how this was highlighted in the Indian Parliament and it was named a world-changing idea. But under the hood, it was still the same estimates of life years lost that was actually used. And they've really gone all in here. They've even said that this relationship, this study from 2013 and 2017 provide a credible basis for generalizing the measured pollution life expectancy. So this validate and defend. In terms of, this is on the same website that we have that statement we looked at originally. And we can see here another rhetorical trick. Particulate air pollution shortens lives globally, even more than cigarettes. And what I've been calling this a repetition with shifted scope. And so the idea is that if you don't actually believe the full statement with the even more than cigarettes, you probably still believe the weaker statement of particulate air pollution shortens lives globally. And so you're unlikely to reject this quote as a whole. And on the other hand, because you actually do believe this narrower statement of particulate air pollution shortens lives globally, it probably increases the chances that you actually believe the next part of the even more than cigarettes as well. What we've got here is also a make it relative. Again, is comparing multiple different threats and expressed very strongly as fact. There is no greater current risk. And perhaps what we've got added here is an appeal to authority as part of it to try to eliminate the uncertainty even further. So then this was then picked up in this Washington Post article. And they do mention here what the source is of the numbers, and they have that indication that the number depends on where you live. But both of those seem to be not as a way of addressing uncertainty, but more as a way of just recognizing where the information comes from. In particular, this was accompanied by then plots that allow you to explore how the number varies depending on where you are in the world. So at this point, we're probably thinking, well, they've gone for a really strong framing here. Why did they actually do this? And fortunately, the Washington Post article gives us an answer just at the start. Those numbers are startling, and that's the point. University of Chicago researchers wanted to make air quality measurements less abstract and more relatable. And what is more relatable than years of life? The intention here was not to provide reliable numbers or anything in that direction. It was simply about grabbing attention. And that's where they've gone for that elimination of all the other forms of uncertainty framing that we're previously using. They do have a little bit of a additional uncertainty framing there of restricting the scope, of saying these numbers are a warning, not a death sentence. The present is not destiny. That this is just a point in time. This is one estimate at a point in time, and it's not actually how things are going to end up in future. And so because they already have that framing there, that it's all about raising attention rather than anything else, they've then taken liberties to go quite strongly into the rest of it as well. They've described how the method was approached in very factual terms. They said the team was able to link the concentration to life expectancy, an indication of success, that it is actually achieved. Here there's a looser framing. This is not one in my original analysis. There's kind of an ambiguous cohesion here, that they've gone straight from saying they've been able to link the concentration to saying the next year the Chinese government responded to public outcry and launched a war against pollution. And so, they're not really implying that the analysis caused this response, but they're linking them in a way that's going to look good to the reader. And they then want to tie it to other evidence on the ground as well. They say it's according to ground monitors. There's an appeal to authority that the results are reliable. And then it's coupled again with this repetition with shifted scope. That first statement seems quite acceptable, saying that the pollution dropped by 32% and it's a reliable source. That's quite believable. Saying that last year alone it dropped by 20%, that's a much stronger claim. And so they've put the two together and even made it's only reportedly dropped 20%, that it's take it or leave it. And so if we look at the frames that have been used in this third case, we have very strong use of the rhetorical approaches of this relatability, of repeated with shifted scope, new view on existing result. And they've also doubled down into supporting the factual nature of these claims. So what do I think about how they've actually gone about things? Well, I can understand why they've done it the way they have, right? And what they've ended up doing is they've kind of focused on this end of the chain of the framings they use sound like they're in the direction of recommendation for action and ensuring that you're heard, evaluating the support of I guess my opinion here is that actually they should have been aiming at that other end. That because their focus was on drawing attention, the framing should maybe have emphasized that maturity of results. And so unsurprisingly, in this sense, I agree with both Dockery and Guillaume that this idea of saying this was just a step towards a goal, that it's just one estimate, that there's still a lot of work to be done. Perhaps we could have actually, those wordings could have been inserted into, especially the Washington Post article. From our water resources research analysis, we ended up with some recommendations for managing and framing uncertainty, obviously specifically for scientific articles. So we can look at how that compares to this case. And wanted to pay attention to framing, that we should cast a wide net, recognizing that there's many ways of managing uncertainty, that the approach should be fit for purpose to avoid advocating a particular single approach. We wanted uncertainty to be announced even in abstracts, that these summary statements are in fact very important. And we wanted uncertainty frames to be interpreted in context. So the authors originally in the Chen et al. 2013 paper did a good job, right? They did announce the uncertainty even in the abstract, and they even had multiple forms of uncertainty there. But there was this bit of a clash that they were both presenting the results as a suggestion and with the backing of the statistical methods. And so here I think what we're seeing is this impact of the pressure to use the statistical methods, that if the circumstances that were different, they might not have actually included that in the confidence interval in that context. The importance there of interpreting uncertainty frames in context is also from the point of view of the audience that has responded to it. So Guillaume, for instance, focused exclusively on that statistical claim because that's the context in which he's actually operating, and didn't really focus on the fact that they did have that additional doubt elsewhere in the abstract. We also had more specific recommendations in terms of making incremental science more dynamic and influential. We wanted to highlight uncertainty, not hide it. Think twice about validate and defend so that we let the reader decide whether the argument is good enough. Not hide behind a narrow scope and instead look for generalized conclusions with ambitious goals. Aim for actionable conclusions. And this one's less relevant to this case of testing before publication. Think twice about just a possibility. Define the limits of uncertainty analysis. Avoid this repeat with shifted scope, and do publish speculation of intermediate results. And so how did this paper do in this case? Well, it kind of fell short on the defining the limits of uncertainty analysis. There was this notion that the statistical analysis is the end word on the topic. They did, however, highlight the uncertainty. They didn't present it as a valid result as such. And they did aim for a more impactful statement. They didn't hide behind just a possibility. But on the other hand here, what I would have liked to see maybe is that it was portrayed more as a speculative intermediate result rather than a final or definitive one. So my opinion in the end, and this is a take it or leave it, is it's important in these kind of studies for the framing to be maturity first, that these studies are only a step towards the goal of reliable life expectancy loss estimates. P-values are better for hypothesis tests rather than confidence intervals or statements of significance, because they let the reader then make that additional jump of determining whether it's enough or not. And so in this case, there was that issue that the confidence intervals seemed like an indirect way of saying this is a significant statement. So in that sense, the confidence intervals could have been included, but maybe as standalone results, not window dressing. So instead of saying the estimate was about 5.5 years, here's the confidence interval. If they had just said the confidence interval is from 0.8 to 8 or whatever it was, then that uncertainty would actually have been emphasized rather than being a framing for the main claim. And we need to acknowledge that the statistical analyses do not capture everything. Even in the abstract, we can do that just with a few words. Uncertainty framing cannot be separated from the societal role of science. And so what I've tried to do here in that suspending judgment until the very end is try to be generous in interpreting the author's intention. Even with the Washington Post article, even though they've eliminated all of this uncertainty and ignored all of this prior debate, the intention was, in the end, was about raising raising attention on this, or focusing attention on this topic, and in a sense that was justifiable. And so what we want to do generally is to be able to build a culture of communication about uncertainty. We need to recognize that nothing is ever certain. It's all about fitness for purpose. And if we start from that basis, it makes it much easier to have a conversation about what is actually appropriate in a particular case. Thank you. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to try to answer.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Joseph. That was a really, really nice talk. We have 9 participants now here in the call. Nothing has come through on the chat box, but there's a feature to raise your hand if you wanted to ask a question, but potentially, because we are a smaller group here currently, that we can just open it up if people want to unmute themselves. If there are no questions, then maybe we'll see if Ivan, on behalf of Car, has an opinion, because he definitely works in this area, and he's definitely offering insightful comments on this at the Car meetings.
I'm also interested in what everyone else thought of that. That was really great, Joe.
It seems like I'm not sure if you have an opinion, Joseph, on where, I guess, obviously we have a responsibility to take these points on board when we're writing up publications or manuscripts to be published. But I wonder if you see a role in kind of this role being institutionalized, in that the same way that we apply for ethical clearance to conduct tests with certain types of sensitive data, that prior to submission to publication, that an institution has a point of reviewing papers for this. If you see that as overstepping the mark, or do you think that's something that people would find useful, or if you have an opinion on that?
It obviously depends on the particular domain of application. And so there are domains, and the reason for that is because it is so context specific, that even the specific claim you're making might change what is the appropriate framing for that case. So there are examples where it has been institutionalized. So like with the IPCC, they do have this calibrated language, for instance, for probabilities, to try to achieve a certain level of consistency in the way uncertainty is communicated and framed. The other issue there, though, is that once the results are out there, they kind of take on a life of their own. And so no matter how much effort the institution and the authors put in to begin with, it is going to be reframed along the way. And so from that point of view, we might even be talking about a broader role for the institution of finding ways and establishing collaborations to be able to influence how things are talked about after it's published as well. So for example, in the Washington Post article, clearly those authors were involved in that framing. And I suppose that's a low-hanging fruit, that it makes sense that institutions would be able to provide support, maybe, of experts who are able to look at how uncertainty is framed in media releases in particular. I think that's an area that most scientists don't necessarily have as much experience in, and because there is so much pressure for impact, they're willing to cut corners more extremely. And if they're not, then they're probably insisting on the more traditional framing, like the confidence interval, which isn't actually appropriate in this case. So basically, the suggestion I was making for the Washington Post article is they should have just used the word estimate somewhere, and the fact that this was maybe a first estimate or a first of its kind analysis, that would already have been kind of indication that this is not a mature product. So yeah, there's a couple of things there that institutions could do, I suppose.
I don't want to ask a question, Joe. I just wanted to look at a picture. Can you show me? It's a bit busy. It's A, B, C, D, and E. It's your graphic from your paper that shows the different frames.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just wanted to look at it while maybe
Sure.
I can tell you a slide. Yeah, that one. It's a bit busy, and I think it deserves a bit of stepping back and considering. And I liked how you pulled bits out of it.
Yeah, so this is obviously meant as a summary figure, kind of graphic abstract. And yeah, I admit it's not ideal for a presentation. But what we've tried to do here is to have that multiple levels of information that you're pulling out. So at the first level, it's just that recognition that uncertainty is not just about uncertainty quantification and level of belief. There are these 5 different categories and that are answering different questions in the process. Each of them the first 4 at least, we've then put them in terms of kind of this continuum. I think it's in terms of a strength of argument, but that's also context specific. And so even before seeing what those specific frames are, that's the notion that we're having there, that within each of those dimensions, we have this continuum of options that can actually be picked. And then the blue text that I didn't actually describe is the rationale of that question of why would you actually be framing uncertainty in this way? And so if I go through that now, but briefly maybe, in terms of maturity, it is that idea that uncertainty doesn't need to disappear right now, that uncertainty can be reduced later. And so what we can do is simply delay a definitive conclusion and invest in future work as we're getting there. In terms of scope, that's a related idea, but from a different angle, that we can get a definitive answer on a narrow topic and maybe make assumptions to generalize it to something broader. So in the short term, we just answer an easier question with the understanding that we know it's not the whole picture. In terms of level of belief, the idea there is that level of belief is a way to help reason about uncertain information. And there's been arguments, that even probability is the only way of rationally reasoning about uncertain information. But what we've introduced there is kind of some thresholds as well. That the validate and defend, it means that the probabilities have reached a threshold where instead of using the probabilities directly, we simply say this was good enough. And the take it or leave it is kind of another threshold of saying it was good enough for me personally, and I don't care whether somebody else also thinks it's good enough. In terms of depth and analysis, it's that idea of we can address uncertainty by considering the effect of alternative assumptions. We're saying which of the if we use these assumptions, we get this result. If we get these assumptions, we get that result. Or in the case of triangulation, what we're hoping is that they'll give the same result. And the last one, relatability, was that idea of uncertainties handled in communication by anticipating differences in opinion. So the uncertainty disappears if the reader and author both agree on something. It's ignored or suppressed along the edges. Does that help, Ivan?
Yes.
But yeah, I obviously would like to advertise the paper for a more in-depth discussion of that.
Sure. Where do we find that?
So it's in Water Resources Research, a publication in 2017. I can send the link through to.
Okay. So it seems like the audience has been very much enlightened and no questions have come up. It's all very clear. So yeah, we might wrap it up.
No, let's not, because we've got 5-6 more minutes of Joe's time.
Okay.
He's a captive audience.
Go ahead, Ivan. I'll let you wrap it up.
So you've really bared the soul of the epidemiological writing to to what I've understood for a while now, there's the statistical significance filter, and it's the only game in town. But no one's very happy about it, so they adhere to a great deal of rhetorical wordsmithing, to try and get around the fact that that a lot of this is purely based on the p-value.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you're pushing for is great. It's an uncertainty framing literacy.
Yes.
That we can have all of this depth of language and argumentation, and that's great. But the journalists who take this information, they still understand the statistical significance filter is the only game in town, and they'll remove all the extra words that we put around it and put it out there. And I'm concerned that if you actually increase the uncertainty framing literacy for journalists,
Mm-hmm.
without also skilling up scientists, we're going to get more and more shifty, unethical uses of science on both sides, things that we agree with and things that we don't. Is that what do you think about that? Is that a fair judgment?
I suppose to some extent, there's a question of power in knowledge systems. And I suppose for a long time, scientists have taken for granted that we have the authority, and that when we speak, people listen to us. And that includes, as we've become more aware of the limitations of our own work, that includes we expect people to actually pay attention to the probabilities and the confidence intervals and the any other indication like that we give. And the fact is that it's increasingly the case that the world isn't working that way. That the authority of scientists is being challenged. And so what you're talking about there is kind of just describing the world that we're moving into. So the question becomes, well, what is the role of scientists in that new world? And I suppose one approach there is the notion of post-normal science of Fontovitz and Ravitz and others, who recognize that it's very important to have an extended peer review of understanding the role of stakeholders, of decision makers within this process. That scientists aren't just about providing the answer that others will accept. It's about helping others to understand the situation and to make sense of it themselves as part of that process. So from that point of view, it goes beyond even increasing literacy, because increasing literacy is increasing the power of journalists or scientists, manipulating how they present their views. Sorry. So what we're after here is also a broader paradigm shift of understanding how can scientists actually engage with stakeholders, with decision makers, so that they're actually listened to. Sorry about the interruption.
I love the statement. This is a broader paradigm shift that we're after. I'll support that.
Oh, great.
Who's on board for the revolution, guys? Okay, I think Tom actually meant I was to bring it home because he's left. So
Yep.
That's the end of your hour, and I want to thank you so much. And on behalf of Car and everyone who attended and will watch this in the future, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.